Today's daf is daf Hey, and the Gemara quoted Rav Papa at the bottom of daf Daled Omid Beis that there's a difference between what's called a hechsher kavua and a hechsher she'eno kavua. So, for example, in the case of a nazir that has to bring a whole set of karbanos in order to permit him to go back to normal citizenship, and he's allowed to drink wine, etc., etc., that's called hechsher she'eno kavua. In other words, it's not something that has a kvius. In other words, a fixed time for the sacrifice. And on the top of Daf Hey and Aleph, I'm just finishing this up so we could start today's learning. The Gemara quotes a Mishnah that all the Nazir has to do in order to allow himself a heter for all the Surei Nazir is he doesn't have to bring all three karbanos, but if he brings, let's say, the karban chatos alone, so that should be sufficient. And the Gemara then asks a question on Rav from Asham Mitzora, in the case where it was Shalol Lishma, and it's Ola Legabi Mizbeach, and it needs Nesachim, and it needs another second Asham Lachshiro, and the Gemara ends up with Shuvta Derav. Okay, let's start, because again, if we go into that sugya, we'll never get out of it. Let's start with Rab Shimon ben Lakish. So let's just see how many lines down from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. Rab Shimon ben Lakish, Omar. Okay. So this is really the beginning of today's study. Minchas ha'omer shekmotza shelo lishma kshera. According to Reish Lakish, as opposed to Rav, and Rav, we ended up with a Tiyuvta de Rav, Reish Lakish holds that if the kmitza of a minchas ha'omer was shelo lishma, then the mincha is perfectly kosher. And that would mean that l'chora, right now you can eat the shirayim of the kmitza, right? Every mincha has kmitza, and then the shirayim, whatever is left out of after the kmitza is only a small amount, that's eaten by the kohanim. But here in this case, Reish Lakish says that shireha enam nechola. Now, let's explain why this is so. The Omer is matir chadash. All the new grains from this year's crop are prohibited until the Omer is brought. And in this case, since the Kmitza was Shalol Lishma, Reish Lakish holds we need a second Omer, so to speak, to replace the first Omer, and that's going to permit and be matir the Isur Chodesh. Ad shetavi minchas Omer acheres v'tatirena. So there's an amazing thing going on here in Reish Lakish. The first Omer that he brought, which was Shalol Lishma, the Kmitza was Shalol Lishma. The mincha is kshera, but yet there's no heter to eat the shirayim because that mincha, that the kmitzu shalol lishma, does not have the power to be matir the Isur Chadash. And as we'll soon see, the rule of thumb is that whatever is osur to eat cannot be brought on the mizbeach. So now he needs a second omer, the kmitza of which was done lishma, in order to be matir the Isur Chadash, to remove the Isur Chadash, and that will allow the Kohanim to eat the shirayim of the first Omer, the first Karban Mincha. And that's what Reish Lakish points out over here. Sheshiureha einam nechol man shetavi minchas omer acheres. So the Gemara immediately asks, I don't get it. You're telling me that the first mincha is a mincha kshera. But if it's also because of chadash, then the Isser le-Adam generates an Isser le-Mizbeach. And why is that? Nikrav hechi karva mimashke Yisrael minamuta Yisrael. We have a principle that's derived from a pasuk in Yechezkel called mimashke Yisrael. In other words, you're only allowed to bring on the Mizbeach that which you yourself or any other Jew is allowed to eat or allowed to drink. And therefore, if according to Reish Lakish, the first Omer is not going to be able to be matir the Isur Chadash, then the Omer itself, which is made of barley flour, is prohibited to the Mizbeach, because if it's prohibited to Adam, then ipso facto it's prohibited to the Mizbeach. And that's the principle called Mimashke Yisrael. So how then can Reish Lakish recognize the first carbon, the first mincha that he brought, and allow that to be brought on the Mizbeach if it's also for hejot, meaning for our achila, to eat that chadash, because this shalol lishma mincha cannot be matir the Isur chadash. Omer of Adabar Ava, kasavar Reish Lakish ein mechusas man lebo bayom. Okay, this is a brand new principle in Kodshim about mechusar zman lebo bayom, meaning if something within a period of one single day is aser but will become mutter, that's called mechusar zman. We're just waiting it out until it becomes mutter. In such a case, there's no psul in the carbon. It's almost as if we anticipate what's going to happen later in the day already now. And therefore, since he's going to bring a second Omer today on the 16th of Nisan to replace the first Omer, then the first Omer is mutal mizbeach. And why? Because a mechusas man lebo bayom is not considered mechusas man. We don't consider it as if it's right now osur. So as it comes out here, there are two different dinim. As far as the Kohen eating the shirayim of the Minchas HaOmer from the first carbon mincha where the Kmitza was Shlo Lishma, that we can't allow him because there's no matir of Chodesh. But nevertheless, the principle of Mimashki Yisrael to prohibit it and disqualify for the Mizbeach doesn't kick in, because as far as Mizbeach is concerned, we can anticipate that which is going to happen on this day, namely that he's going to bring the second carbon and he's going to be matir the Isur Chodesh. Masiv of Ada Bereder of Yitzchak. Okay, now, what we're about to embark upon is a brisa that compares Ophos to Menachos, and is going to show in two different directions. Direction number one is Yesh ba'Ophos she'ein b'Menachos, and direction number two is Yesh b'Menachos she'ein ba'Ophos. So we're looking for to compare and contrast Ophos to Menachos. We're going to find that there are certain special qualities to the Ophos that don't apply to Menachos, and vice versa. And now we go through it. Shah Ophos boim b'nidvas shnayim. Two people could come together as partners in a nidava of an oath. Again, it's not an oath of a tzibur, because keep in mind, as we'll soon see, an oath can never be brought by the tzibur. An oath is always brought by the yachid. But Shutfis is not a tzibur. Shutfis is not a new entity. It's just individuals that get together and they bring a carbon. In this case, they bring an idava from an oath. However, Menachos, in the case of Menachos, the Torah used the word nefesh, kisikrav mincha, and the nefesh in the singular indicates that only one person could bring a single mincha, and there's no such thing as shutfim who can gather together to bring a carbon mincha. Umechusrei kapara. Okay, now Mechusrei kapara means zav, zava, yoledes, or mitzora. In those four cases, it's not enough that these tmeim undergo all the processes and segments of tahara, but they also need to bring a korban. And until they bring their korban, they're called mechusrei kapara. They're lacking the korban, and they're not allowed to eat kodshim. They're not allowed to enter into the Beis Hamikdash. And they will bring ophos, right? And the ophos will be mashlim the tara process. Again, it's called kapara in the language of the Gemara, but really the word kapara in this context means tahara. So even though, as he points out here in the note, they already went to the mikvah, but not only that, on the very next day, they still have to bring ophos as part of the Gemar Tahara to complete the Tara. There's nothing that parallels that in Menachos. Number 3, Hutru Mechlal Isuram Bekodesh Mashein came Menachos. There's another unique aspect if we compare Ophos to Menachos, and that is what's called Hutar Mechlal Isuran, which means that in general, an oaf, if you and I want to eat chicken, we can't do so without shchita. But in the case of gava, of kodshim, all you need is malika. So the Iser Nevela that would apply to us, if somebody were to take a bird and with his thumbnail, he would kill the bird, that's Nevela, and we're not allowed to eat that. But yet, Ligava, it's mutter. And that means that the Iser Nevela was Hutar Mechlalo. There was a heter on the Iser Nevela through Ophos, through the Malika of an oaf that replaces the Shchita of an oaf. The Yesh Menachos, what do we find that's unique in Menachos, on the flip side of the coin? Shamenachos to unos kli. Oh, here there's a gigantic machlokas exactly what this means. We'll go right now with Rashi's Pshat. And Rashi's Pshat is that the kmitza of a mincha can only take place after Kiddush Kli, which means that the flour, and in most cases the oil that's mixed with the flour, has to go into a Kli. That Kli is a Kli Shares, and that Kli Shares sanctifies the mincha such that now we can go ahead with the kmitza and the avoda of mincha. There's nothing parallel in ophos. You don't have to take an oaf and put it into any sort of a vessel of a kli shares in order to mekadesh it. Number 2, menachos require tnufa. They require hagasha. Right, tnufa means you wave it around in all 6 directions, etc., etc. And hagasha means is halacha of bringing the mincha to the mizbeach. Yeshna b'tzibur kibiyach mishei b'ofos. There's no such thing as a carbon oath of the tzibur. There should be, but not a tzibur. And in the case of menachos, we have a minchas tzibur. Now, what would be a case of a minchas tzibur? The omer, right? The omer is a carbon mincha that's brought on behalf of the entire tzibur. The Isa. Now, if we accept Reish Lakish, who says that the first mincha that was brought with a kmitza shelo lishma is asur leachilas kohanim, is b'menachos nami mishkachas to hutru mechlal isur b'kodesh. We said here in this brisa, argues Rav Ada, that what's unique about ophos is that it's hutru mechlalo, meaning that no one for achilas adam could eat an oaf after malika, but yet the malika allows it for the mizbeach. Well, guess what? I have a perfect parallel in the case of menachos. Why? Because if, according to Reish Lakish, the kmitza of the korban ha'omer, the minchas ha'omer, was done shelo lishma, then although you're allowed to bring the carbon because lav mechusar zman, etc., etc., but nevertheless it's asul achilas adam, which is exactly parallel to the nevela, which in the case of an oaf became mutar legavah to the mizbeach through malika. Umayliu minchas haomer. So the Gemara answers, no, you misunderstood. When we said according to Reish Lakish that lav kemechusar zman, if it's lebo bayom, what that means is that there is no Isser at all. It's not the pshat that the Torah was matir an Isser that normally applies outside of the Mizbeach for Achilas Adam for the purpose of Mizbeach. That's not so. We're not saying that the reason why you could bring that first carbon Omer that was Kmitza Shalol Lishma is because the Torah is being matir the general Isur of Chadash, but rather what we're saying is that this Omer is a valid karma. Why? Because he's going to bring the second Omer to replace the first one, and ein mechusas man lebo bayom. So again, if we were dealing with a Lomdasha Iyun here, we would have to figure out what does it mean when Reish Lakish says ein mechusas man lebo bayom? Is he saying that it was never prohibited? In other words, we already anticipate as if what's going to happen later today happened now, or it's a special mechanical halacha that works. And here you see it was never prohibited. Masiv Rav Sheshes now attacks Reish Lakish from a brisa. Hiktim matan shemen lematan dam. Okay, so now we're talking about Taras HaMitzorah, and in the process of Taras HaMitzorah, we need two matanos, meaning two applications onto the body of the Mitzorah. We need, number one, shemen, and we need also dam. And the Torah goes out of its way to tell us the order, the sequence of the two, in which matan dam has to come first, and only afterwards matan shemen. But what happened? The Kohen went ahead and he messed up, and he did the matan shemen, right, on the bahonos and so forth and so on, before the matan dam. So the Brisa says, Yimal enu shemen, v'yachzor v'yitein shemen achar matan dam. All he has to do is, he's got to fill up the shemen, and then he'll do another second round of matan shemen, this time following the matan dam. So he started with shemen, messed up by starting with shemen. Then he did dam, and now he's going to have to do shemen again. Yachzor v'yitein shemen acher. I'm sorry, I keep saying acher, but it's acher matan dam. Next, matan bahonos lematan sheva. Right, there are, with regard to the matan of shemen, we need sheva, and then we need bahonos. Instead, he switched around the order. He did the matan bahonos before he did the 7, the matan sheva. Is then, right, he tells you here that on the 8th day of the Mitzorah, when he brings the Asham, the Chatas, and the Ola, because a Mitzorah, after he undergoes Tahara 7 days, on the 8th day he has to bring 3 korbanos, and he's got to bring a Lug Shemen. The Kohen takes the Asham, which is one of the 3 korbanos that the Mitzorah brings, and he takes the Shemen. He then does Shchita on the Asham, and he applies the dam of the shchita of the asham to the mitzorah in 3 places. Number 1, on his right ear. Number 2, his right thumb. And number 3, on his right toe, his big toe. Then, after doing the matan dam, he pours the oil that's some of the oil on, number 1, the left palm of an assisting Kohen, and he, the first Kohen, dips his right forefinger onto the oil and sprinkles it 7 times, keneged the Kodesh Kadoshim. Then he takes more oil from the assisting Kohen's palm, applies it to the Mitzorah's right ear, right thumb, and big toe, then places the remaining oil on the head of the Mitzorah. Anyway, the Torah explicitly requires in the pasuk in Vayikra Yudalid that the Matan Dam come first, but this Kohen decided that he's going to switch around the order. Now, this sprinkling that we spoke about, Keneged Kodesh Kadoshim, should be performed before the Matan Shemen. But here, what did he do? He did the Matan Shemen, which is called Matan Bahonos, before he did the Matan Sheva of the Keneged, right, of the Shemen Keneged the Kodesh Kadoshim, is then Yimalenu Shemen, the Yachsav Yitain Matan Bahonos Achar Matan Sheva, to make sure that we don't know what's going on over here. When he switches around the order and he did the Matan Shemen before the Sheva, is that a Pegia in the Sheva or is that a Psul in the Matan Shemen? So that's really what the Gemara is dealing with here. So the Gemara asks the following: I don't get it. So what if he did the Matan Bahonos before the Matan Shemen? So what if he did the Matan Shemen before the Matan Dam? It's irrelevant. Since he's going to do another round, and he's going to replace it with a Matan Shemen after the Matan Damim, or, for example, he's going to do the Matan Bahonos after the Sheva, so then it's Bo Bayom. And if it's Bo Bayom, according to Reish Lakish, then there's no need for him to do it again, because the first one is considered valid because Ein Mechusas Man LeBo Bayom. And the Gemara answers, and the Gemara finishes its question by saying, "My di'ovid ovad." Omer Papa Shani Hilchus Mitzora Dichsivbu Havaya. The Omer Kosev Zos Tias Torah Hamitzora Tia Bavayasa Tia. And I think what the Gemara is answering is that you made a mistake. You thought that the problem was with the Matan Shemen that came before the Matan Dam, and that's like a psul in the Matan Shemen, and therefore you objected based on Reish Lakish's principle that Ein Mechusas Man LeBo Bayom. No. The problem here is in the Matan Dam, that the Matan Dam has to come first. And the Torah requires that it become first because the Torah went out of its way to tell you that Matan Dam comes first. Now it didn't come first, and therefore, in order to set up the Matan Dam as coming before the Shemen, you have to do another Matan Bahonos with the Shemen after the Matan Dam. And the same thing applies with the Sheva. Masi Rav Papa, again Rav Papa, like Rav Ada before him, is going to challenge Rav Reish Lakish. Hikdim, we have a brayso that says Chatoso li'ashamo. Just 1 second. Right, so just to review what we said one more time, just to get it through. On the 8th day, the Mitzvah brings number 1 an Asham, a Chatos, number 2, and number 3 an Olah. Okay, and apparently the Asham comes first, and the Chatos has to come second. That's what the Torah says. And he messed up, and he brought the Chatos first, and then the Asham. Right. So now, what do we do with this korban chatos that he brought before the asham, and he messed up the sequence because the asham was meant to come before the chatos? So you might think that in such a case, let's just bring the asham, and then we'll do the matan damim on the chatos. The only problem is it's going to take a while till we do the asham, so we need what's called memaris, right? Because the dam, if it congeals, then it's posel lemizbeach. It's ein roy l'zrika. So I'm leaving out the word lo for a second to explain what it would have been, but it's not. Yeh achem memoris b'dam. You might say that give over the dam that you received in the mizrach, in the klishores, from the chatos over to another person, and he'll mix it constantly without stopping, so that it doesn't become dam shekarush. But lo, we're not going to allow that. But rather, elatu bar tzura v'teisa the beis hasreifa, he's going to have to bring a whole nother carbon chatos. So the Gemara asks, I don't get it. Why can't he be yotze with this chatos, even though the chatos came before the asham? Because Reish Lakish's principle that lo mechusas man, we don't say lepo bayom that there's mechusas man. So since he's anyway going to bring the asham, let the mizbeach anticipate, so to speak, what's going to happen after he brings the asham, and the chatos should be kshera. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. Rav Papa, you just asked that same question and you gave the answer. Now, my kamosa Rav Papa, the Yom Shani Hilchas Mitzora, to Ksiva Havaya. Meaning, we're following what the Torah said. The Torah said that the Osham has to come before the Chatos. And if the Chatos was brought before the Osham, that's not a Chatos. That's totally possible. And has nothing to do with Reish Lakish's principle that we don't apply Mechusas Man when it's Bo Bayom, because that's not going to help you kiyuzeh. Because the Torah is saying that chatos is not a chatos. And that's the principle that Papa already established before when we were talking about the log shemen, and we were talking about the nesinas dam, and we said that the Torah says that the nesinas dam has to come first, or the sheva keneged kodesh kadoshim that we spoke about. Ella, but rather a papa hachi kakad kashale ema hani mili avoda, but shchita lav avoda he. Rav Papa said the following: yes, with regard to avoda, the Torah, when it goes out of its way to set up the seder, the sequence, and the oshav has to come before the chatos, that's correct. Let's say he went ahead and he did this rikas dam of the chatos before he brought the osham, then for sure the chatos would be a problematic thing. But that's because rikas dam is an avoda. But now we're talking about shchita. He went ahead and he shechted the animal, meaning the chatos, before the osham. And therefore, since shchita is not called an avoda, which means that a zar could do the shchita of a karvan, you don't need a kohen, is therefore we go back to the regular principles of ein mechusas man lebo bayom. And therefore, a papa asks the question: ein mechusas man lebo bayom yehei achem b'maris b'dama likarev asham v'ado likarev chatas. Let's just keep the dam mixed up so that it doesn't become dam korish. And then after he shechts the asham, let him now do the rest of the avoda of the shchit of the chatos, and let him do the zrikas hadam of the chatos. Why do you say to ubad surasa and you take it out to the beis hasreifa? And the answer is because tichsiv bihu havaya. Okay. Now again, let's go back to the drawing board at this point, because Rav Papa has proven that since shchita is not an avoda, and yet if he shechted the chatos, he's got to bring another chatos, and the first chatos goes out to Beis Hapsul, that we cannot maintain the position of Reish Lakish of ein mechusas man lebo bayom. So now Rav Papa is going to try to make an attempt to reinterpret Reish Lakish in a way that we don't need to operate and apply the principle of ein mechusas man lebo bayom, but rather we're going to assume that there is mechusas man lebo bayom. Elam Rav Papa hainu time of the Reish Lakish. Let me give you a substitute explanation of Reish Lakish and why Reish Lakish holds that if the kmitza of the Omer, the Minchas HaOmer was done Shalol Lishma, then it's mutal akrova, even though, again, as we said before, the shiraim cannot be eaten by the Kohen. Haini time v'shlokish, the kosover heir mizrach matir. The Gemara has a whole new approach. What's the matir of the Isur Chodesh? We assume that it was the Hakrovas HaOmer, the Minchas HaOmer. No, no, no. It's the Heir Yom. As soon as the 16th of Sivan breaks out with daybreak in the morning, that itself is matir. Now, again, if it's Shalom Bisman HaMikdash, there's no Mikdash, and you can't bring the Omer, I understand that the Tzumo Shel Yom, the 16th, which is the day in which they normally would bring the Omer, that could be matir. But we're talking about even when the Mikdash stands, and nevertheless, Reish Lakish decides, according to Rav Papa's new interpretation, that the Omer is not needed as a matir of the Isur Chodesh. The Isur Chodesh is generated just by the emergence of the day itself, the day of the 16th. And we'll see later on that Rav rejects this, but Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, Yamich Avayu, they agree that afilu bisman shebeis hamikdash kayim, which means that they could bring the Omer. Nevertheless, Heir Mizrach matir. You don't need the Omer.